You know our topic tonight. We're dealing with U.S. relations with the Arab Islamic world, and we're wondering where it's going. And we're absolutely delighted to have John Duke Anthony with us to make the presentation. I hesitate to say anything about him since he's been here before. He first spoke here in 1987. This is his 8th visit. We make it a general policy of not asking anyone a second time. But it's a comment on Dr. Anthony's presentations that he's with us again. And there are many memorable ones. I was especially impressed by the set of arguments he made against going to Baghdad a long time ago. Coherent, cogent, complete. And you'll find that the topic tonight will be covered in a similar fashion. Dr. Anthony is a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, where parenthetically his classmates thought well of him, 4-time president of his class and president of the Cadet Corps. He holds a master's degree, which he received from the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and he holds a PhD from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in International Relations and Middle East Studies. He's the author of 3 books that are well known on the Gulf area of the world. The first one, the best known probably, is on the politics, people, and petroleum of the lower Gulf states. His most recent is in state building, the story of it, in the United Arab Emirates. He's, in addition to that, he's the author of almost 200 monographs and articles on that part of the world and American interests in it. He's taught at a number of major institutions. He's taught at Pennsylvania and Texas, at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the major defense institutes, and presently is teaching at Georgetown as an adjunct professor. He's certainly highly regarded in his field. He's done the remarkable thing of founding and working on boards of a number of important institutions, dealing with largely studies of the Middle East, but also concerned with the questions of peace, especially Israeli-Palestinian peace. He's been a regular lecturer and consultant at both the Department of State and the Department of Defense. He's received awards not only from those 2 major American institutions, a number of nonprofit organizations, and a number of Arab nations. We've always enjoyed Dr. Anthony's presentations, and they're based upon a great depth of knowledge. The briefings that he did at State and Defense have been going on for 35 years. So he's been somewhere longer than he's been at this council. Before I introduce him finally, let me just make a reference quickly on a tangential topic, but it's someone else who was very important to this council. Senator Mathias passed along recently, of course. Senator Mathias was extraordinarily helpful to this council when it was formed, with good advice and coming to us as a speaker as well. So this organization owes a lot to Senator Mathias, and we certainly remember him this evening. But as I said, our topic tonight deals with our relations with the Arab Islamic world. All of us are concerned about the resurgence of the Islamic world and where that may be going. And we're concerned whether indeed there are serious threats to the well-being of the United States. And certainly the dozens of questions which are involved in that, which are on the minds of most people, are all important. And we're absolutely delighted that Dr. Anthony is here to make his observations about that phenomenon. Dr. Anthony.
Thank you, Dr. Byrd, Ambassador Kingdom Gould, other members of the trustees, members of this organization, friends, supporters, guests for the first time. It's a delight to be back here. And when Dr. Byrd mentioned that this is my 8th time, that was diplomatic speak for my being, as it were, in a university from which there's no possible graduation. And when I have give and take with all of you, or just one of you, or some of you, nothing but a series of murky incompletes. This is my favorite of all of America's World Affairs Councils, in the sense that there are 99 of them nationwide, and the World Affairs Councils, along with the Foreign Policy Association members, which at this time are focusing on their annual Great Decisions series, you have more than 500,000 people. By my lights, you constitute around 90% of the private sector, concerned citizenry, active in the pursuit of increasing information and insight, knowledge and understanding towards America's position role in the world beyond our shores. And so this kind of turnout is extraordinary. And I commend you, I commend Dr. Byrd and your leadership and your activism. In prefacing my remarks this evening, I wanted to say 2 or 3 things to give background, context, and perspective to offer where I'm coming from. One is that if in my prepared remarks I focused on Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan or Pakistan or the Arab-Israeli conflict, this would be at the expense of sort of higher levels of generalization in an effort to provide a framework for our discussion and debate, even our disagreement there. So I would propose that I handle questions about those 5, which remain burning issues and are not going to go away during the Q&A. Secondly, I want to underscore, italicize, neonize, and capitalize the following: that this is a part of the planet that is of extraordinary emotional importance to people. Here we try to strive for logic and rationality and equanimity and balance, but the reality is that many of us are caught up in these issues in this part of the world emotionally. Of the 6 billion human beings, fully half, have their ancestral origins in their faith, in their values, in their culture, in the rootedness of their moral principles, anchored in this particular region. And this half are oriented towards, for lack of a better phrase, a sky god, a heaven, an almighty father, if you will. The other half is not. And that other half is not nearly as focused or as embedded or as intensely emotional about this particular region as that first half. And so we need to keep this in mind. With respect to this region and its emotionality, we have to, I think, at the outset concede the following. That for that 50%, this is the cradle of culture, as that 50% would acknowledge. It is the crucible of civilization, as that 50% would acknowledge. It's the place where, in terms of recorded history of that 50%, the first people died, The first child cried. The first lovers sighed. It is at one and the same time also the birthplace of the three monotheistic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, making some days in the region appear figuratively as though it is the traffic jam of the devout. It is also the source of sunshine on the classical world, from which we have learned endlessly and was a direct link to the Renaissance and the development of the Western world as we know it. It is also the anvil of antiquity and the source of energy, particularly oil and gas, 70% of that which is proven beyond debate for humankind, that drives the standard of living of not just Westerners, North Americans, and the United States, but that of economies throughout the planet here. So I want to acknowledge that up front. Secondly, that this city is resemblant or representative of a significant part of this emotionality, not just in terms of Christians, not just in terms of Muslims, both of whom are represented here this evening, but perhaps inordinately or disproportionately and certainly significantly Jewish Americans. I'm aware from each of the occasions I've been privileged and honored to be with you before that there's perhaps as many as 30% who come to these events, in my experience, come from families that perished at Auschwitz or Treblinka or Bergen-Belsen and elsewhere. Perhaps more than one or two or three have tattoos on their wrist that they are the sole survivor of the Holocaust. And I'm aware, just reading today, that of the 200,000 survivors of the Holocaust that live in Israel, a report today was issued that 2/3 of that 200,000 suffer in one degree or another from depression and distress as they look as much through the rear view window for what befell them as they do through the front windshield. And I'm aware that you have not been idling at the intersection to share this horrible, horrific experience with your fellow citizens in terms of the Holocaust Museum here, which I applaud you for. I came 2 weeks ago hoping to go to it. I missed it by 5 minutes before they shut their doors, but I'll come back for sure, as I have been to the one in Washington on several occasions. And the last time, believe it or not, at the request of a member of the ruling family of one of the most important pivotal players of position and prominence in the Arabian Peninsula. He took the initiative and said, I want to go, I need to go. I need to share with my people what I learned from going through such an institution as that. And of course, in the last year, we had a person who was on in years who went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and shot one of the security guards. And of course, this is the 65th anniversary of the end of the Holocaust as such. So I want you to know at the outset that I'm not oblivious or unempathetic to this emotionality that lives in quite a few people. And then secondly, I would like to posit the following as a frame of reference for thinking, for analyzing, for deriving something in the way of implications for our knowledge and understanding. That even were we to come to agreement on ways to proceed and to solve certain outstanding, long-standing issues, even if we were to come to something less than that, and namely to ameliorate the reality of the reality in some of these issues, even were we to come to agreement on how better to manage the manifestations of some of these crises and tragedies, this would not be a panacea. This would not be a surgical removal of all of the issues that will continue to challenge the best and the brightest amongst us all. Posit, for example, the following, and for this, my thoughts are not original to me, but to a former British spooky person I met 2 or 3 years ago, Alistair Crooke, C-R-O-O-K-E, who had been in the British clandestine service for about 3 decades and focusing on this part of the world. And he came up with the following, which I find profound and unassailable in the acuity of its insight. to distinguish between those in the so-called West, which would include Europe, East and Central now as well, and the Americas, North, United States, Central America, Latin America, South America, as being characterized as opposed to those from the East as follows. That for not decades, but for centuries, there has been almost an unchallengeable commitment to the notion of markets. Markets in terms of material, tangible quest and possessions in life. Secondly, a respect almost bordering on reverence writ large for rational thinking. Let the best idea win, and don't let it be fettered by ideology or shibboleths or religious beliefs or hand-me-down so-called established thought or informed opinion or collective or wisdom. And thirdly, the focus on the individual, which really at the end of the day comes down to me, first person singular. And that this distinguishes most of the West. Of course, all generalizations like this are superficial and can be challenged, but I think as a general proposition, it's got a lot going for that. Over and against an Eastern context and framework, namely where the first and foremost of the values and the moral principles and things by which people from the East in this part of the world, namely Arabs and Muslims, and not just Arabs, but other Middle Easterners who are also Muslims, number one would be notions of justice versus injustice. Number two would be compassion for the less fortunate, for the downtrodden, for the victim, for the other end of oppression. Number three would be equity, which of course has a notion of justice in it, but it's more in the secular layperson's framework of fairness, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time for the right reasons and the right people there. And a fourth would have to do with not being apologetic about being pious, about being proud of one's beliefs, being proud to be active, protective, assertive, illustrative, a role model if one could be, in keeping with the tenets of one's beliefs. And fifthly, the greater emphasis on the communal versus the individual, the larger number rather than the microcosm there. And so in this instance, perceived from the region, I'm an Anthony. Perceived from this audience, perhaps I'm perceived as John Duke. But from the region's perspective, it is the family that is more important than any particular individual. Now, with those as frames of reference, I would like to do sort of a cost accounting here and try to see if there's a balance or symmetrical or maybe an asymmetrical or imbalanced sheet. And I've tried to break my points down into pluses, things that we have going for us, that we have reason to be proud of, and we need to go from strength to strength, that are not generally published in the American mainstream media, whether it's radio, television, magazines, what have you. And then I'll proceed to the negative, and I will give as many telling examples of each in the limited time we have here. Because the media upon which so many of us are dependent for what it is that we agree is valid or our insights is struck with the adage of it bleeds, it leads. And if it's violent, all the more so, than if something is peaceful. How many of you, I certainly have not yet read any story in any media about mothers and fathers helping their daughters and sons with their homework at night. This is hardly attention-grabbing per se. But if one is charitable now, and not just so much suspend judgment, but even consider judgment of the following, there's a lot more positive between the United States and its Arab and Muslim friends, partners, allies, and even its adversaries and enemies than one might imagine. Consider the following. And the core of the geopolitical and geostrategic and geoeconomic part of the Arab and Islamic world, namely the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, all are mindful of what the United States did to liberate Kuwait in 1991 from Iraq's aggression. And on that occasion, like few before and even fewer since, the United States, for once, upheld the United Nations United Nations Charter in terms of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force, in terms of national sovereignty, in terms of political independence and territorial integrity, in terms of international law. All of those that had been smashed to smithereens were restored to the Kuwaiti people. Likewise in terms of Bosnia, likewise in terms of Kosovo, likewise in terms of East Timor, in terms of two peoples who had tens of thousands made refugees, but the U.S. Drew a line and said this is wrong, morally wrong, illegally wrong, and the U.S. stood for the return of those refugees. So these are prisms through which we're seeing. In this state, in terms of the National Institute for Health, perhaps many of you did a double take and had to read it 4 times to figure out that, my gosh, it's true. That a Muslim was made the head of the National Institute of Health, an Algerian, Dr. Zerhouni, one of the most prestigious, prominent scientific and technological institutes in the United States upon which so many of us are reliant. And that even in the last administration, led by a president who did not top the Richter scale in terms of propriety and popularity in the Arab and Islamic world, at least he went out of his way every year at Ramadan time to hold an iftar there in celebration and commemoration of one of the seasons and duties and obligations, morally and otherwise, of those who adhere to the Islamic faith. And that rather than sweep everything under the rug, there was a 9/11 commission, and it had some of the most outstanding Americans on it in terms of Lee Hamilton and Governor Keene from New Jersey, that amongst many other things exonerated Saudi Arabia's role at the official level in having anything whatsoever to do with that tragedy that befell so many Americans on September 11th, 2001. We'll come back to the 9/11 Commission momentarily there. And then also under the Bush administration, there was the enunciation of the roadmap, and particularly joining 3 other international players, the Soviet Union, or Russia rather, the United Nations and the European Union, which then called for a moratorium on settlements and establishing illegal facts on the ground and land grabs at the expense of the Palestinian people. And that being called the Quartet, against the background and the foundation of 2 other momentous things here in this state, namely the Wye River meetings with President Clinton in 1998 in October, and also the Annapolis Conference, which was the last of the large great power ones just up the road here. Then switching fastly to the most recent election, that someone like Barack Obama was elected President of the United States. Maybe none of you have been to the region, or you've been here or there, or it's been a long time, but I can tell you few things resonated more positively that the American people could elect someone of color, could elect someone who was so closely associated with Islam, to elect someone whose father was Muslim, to elect someone who had some of the most formative influences on his upbringing and childhood in a place like Indonesia as well. This aspect, on top of the quality and the content and the focus and the nature of his inaugural address roughly a year ago, of reaching out, trying to reach out to the Arab and Islamic worlds with a non-clenched fist. We remember that particular metaphor that he used there. And that his first international interview was with Hisham Melhem of Al Arabiya. And his first major international appointment was George Mitchell. All of this rang with a great resonance and approval from one end of the Arab world to the other, from Morocco to Muscat, Baghdad to Berbera, Algiers to Aden, and Aleppo in between there. As well, though it's not written up in the mainstream American media, are the ongoingness of America's defense cooperation agreements with Kuwait, with Bahrain, with Qatar, with the United Arab Emirates, and with Oman. Indeed, some would say, well, what about the one with Saudi Arabia? Well, we don't have one with Saudi Arabia, but here we must be careful not to confuse form with function. What we have with Saudi Arabia is older than all of the others combined. vaster than all of the others combined, and involving more people on both sides than all of the others combined. With respect to the strategic dialogue, Saudi Arabia's cooperation with the United States Treasury and intelligence communities, national security communities, on trying to curb terrorism financing. There is no other bilateral relationship anywhere in the globe like the American-Saudi Arabian one. As we sit here this moment, there's an American sitting here, a Saudi Arabian sitting there. Next to that Saudi Arabian is an American. Next to that American is a Saudi Arabian, sharing real-time intelligence and information, trying to get on top of this issue. We have nothing like that with France or Great Britain or West Germany or Japan or anybody else on the planet as such. We have now, after a hiatus where the number of Saudi Arabian students in the United States plummeted down to 3 million after 9/11, largely because of fear, treatment at the airport, and many American security people not being able to distinguish between one Muslim or another, or one ethnic group or another, that there are more than 20,000 Saudi Arabian students that have come back into the United States. And still we are drawing down on that bank of reservoir of goodwill of the following in terms of every day since 1975, there have been more American-trained PhDs in Saudi Arabia's cabinet than there have been PhDs of any kind in the United States cabinet, the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the House of Representatives combined. And so despite the italicizing of Arab hatred, Muslim hatred of the United States, the beacon, the positive, the draw, the appeal, approval, and longing for an American-style education is quite alive and well, as is the respect for America's research and development, as is respect for American science and technology. Also, at the most recent Gulf Cooperation Council Ministerial and Heads of State Summit, comprised of Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman, the commitment to stand with America's dollar, to keep their own currencies linked to the American dollars, even though they pay a price for this, even though it's putting so many of their eggs in one basket, even though they realize that most Americans still think of these people as objects to be manipulated, cajoled, coerced, seduced, deterred, more than seeing them as actors with their own legitimate needs, their own legitimate rights, their own legitimate concerns, their own legitimate interests, their own legitimate policy objectives, that they have stood with United States strategic interest in economic and financial and investment and trade and joint venture arrangements, despite being on the receiving end of no end of insults over the course of a year. And also their recent strategic, it's been 2 years now, commitment to peaceful nuclear development, heavily in context with the United States, to a degree as well with Great Britain, as well with France, and also most recently with South Korea. And unknown also to most Americans that the top 3 most generous countries in the world in terms of a percentage of their budgets, percentage of their gross national product, for the last 30 years have been Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Abu Dhabi. Every single year they have the top 3 places there. They are also number 1, 2, and 3 in terms of charity per capita, those 3. Of the 17 most charitable people on the planet, Americans are number 17th. We're at the bottom of that particular list. In terms of helping the victims of Katrina directly, again, the number 1 foreign contributors to the tragedy there were Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates there. And whereas most Americans think that, or certainly polls have reflected that most Americans believe that some 25% of the federal budget goes to foreign aid, the reality is that it is 1/5 of 1%. This is all that a country that has $13 trillion of gross national product a year, 4 times the runner-up. Japan, with its $3 trillion, provides for foreign economic assistance to the world's less fortunate there. And then 2, despite the calls for ending America's foreign reliance or using of foreign oil and gas, which in the region is seen as a code word for Arab, Muslim, and non-Arab Iranian oil, there has been no oil embargo or energy embargo since March 19, 1974, and that contribution to American investors and the economic and commercial managers' ability to anticipate, to predict, to plan, and to prepare in a cost-effective manner has to be in the positive asset column there. Today, or yesterday, the price of oil or gas per gallon is $2.76, roughly what it was 40 years ago. And it's still considerably less than the cost of a gallon of Pepto-Bismol, a gallon of Head & Shoulders, a gallon of Listerine, and a gallon of Coca-Cola, which have considerably less strategic economic influence and impact on our material well-being. With regard to the peace process in the region, on March 31st, 2002, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia was able to cajole and persuade every single Arab head of state to go along with the peace proposal to Israel, to normalize relations with Israel, recognize it, in exchange for Israel withdrawing from the territories illicitly stolen from June 67 on to the present. And that despite the Israelis not answering for 5 years and the United States doing little more than giving lip service to the acknowledgement, they reiterated this, again unanimously, within the last 2 years. Now we go to the minuses, and these are hurtful to those who are unaware. But I'm trying to be as transparent and open and honest as time and circumstances will allow. The ongoing aspect of the last decade in terms of American insensitive, humiliating, arrogant, ill-informed rhetoric, talking about waging a crusade against this part of the world, talking about Arabs wanting to restore the caliphate, when most Americans don't know what a caliphate is, other than some think it's an incomplete sentence. The caliph ate what? A hamburger? A banana? There, in terms of such language as bring 'em on, there, the cowboy, Western barroom type of slang, of saying that we will stay the course, of course, where in the region it was listened to and understood to be we will stay of course, which is indeed the case there. Use of the word of jihadis and jihadist, which again is an insult, both in terms of content as well as insensitivity. And in terms of just the last 2 weeks, the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, in her meeting with the Jordanian foreign minister, saying the following, that she urged that there be a resumption of negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians without conditions, italicizing, put that in quotation marks. In the next sentence, she added, however, reflective of subsequent developments since June 1967. The subsequent development since June 67 was that the Palestinians have lost that many more acres of their land and patrimony of their foremothers and forefathers, and that there be swaps of territory in any renegotiations. Well, the only territory that is up for being swapped is that which the Israelis took from the Palestinians. The Palestinians didn't take an inch, a square centimeter of Israeli land as such. And that providing that the Palestinians do everything to ensure Israeli security, not a word about Israel doing everything to ensure Palestinian security. It's the Israelis that occupy Palestinian land. It's not the other way around. In terms of Jerusalem being referred to simply as a symbol versus an international law in the United Nations Security Council resolutions of 1947 referring to it as a corpus separatum, and the emphasis amongst Christians and Muslims alike of sharing Jerusalem, not letting it be a political territorial football controlled by one over the rights and the aspirations and the emotional and religious longings of the others. In the Secretary's reference to Netanyahu's unprecedented concessions to the Palestinians, this had to be read through 2 or 3 times there, because it exempted Jerusalem, where there's something like 90 homes that are being demolished every single month there, and that Jerusalem is off limits. We've not said anything about the Israelis continuing to seize land illegally, illicitly there. And no mention any longer of the quartet, which probably is appropriate in terms of truth in labeling, because it was a mask and a facade from the beginning in terms of the Russians and the United Nations and the European Union. Now it is to be the United States and Israel and Jordan, which is already at peace with Israel, and an indeterminate number of other Arab states. Noticeable is that there is no mention of dealing with Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, or Hamas. And I've met with, well, over the telephone, to be frank, with George Mitchell on this and his deputy on this once in each case there, and asked them how could this be omitted. And his answer has been, well, because first they have to forswear violence. And said, can you tell me, how is it that in the last century, 13 colonial powers restored national sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity to their colonized people when violence was key to every single one of them? And he said, well, I'm talking about Ireland, and I'm talking about South Africa. And I said, with all due respect, Senator, those are the aberrations. Those are the exceptions. Those of us who are parents, teachers, guidance counselors, role models, try to instill in our youth generally valid truths and realities, not the aberrations and the exceptions. And while we're at this, by not speaking with, by not dealing with, covertly or otherwise, with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, does that reflect the following? Are we serious or are we not about achieving peace, a settlement, and reconciliation? And are we inclusive, involving everybody, or exclusive? Because if it's the latter, we fly right in the face of everybody's agreement that you make peace with your adversaries and enemies, and not with your friends. And it's also in direct opposition to America's own historical record. Thank God the British didn't continue to insist that we lay down our arms as a condition or a precondition for obtaining our independence. The Union Jack would still be over this building. And in case of the Algerians, as it was, 1 million Algerians at independence in 1962 were orphans. And had the French insisted that the Algerians first say that French colonialism and national sovereignty over Algeria would be the price to stop that war for independence, no telling how many more people would be dead as a result. And fast forward to our own history in terms of Vietnam. To the very end, we negotiated with the Viet Cong in North Vietnam, and neither one of them ever recognized the right of the government of South Vietnam to exist. And had we insisted on that in our meetings with the Viet Cong in North Vietnam in Paris, there'd be more than 58,000 names on the mall in Washington of the Americans killed in action there. And there would be a million more Vietnamese as well, whose blood and troops and treasures would have been expended on that particular aspect there. Seen from the region, we're seen as the opposite of what Abba Eban famously said about the Palestinians never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. We're seen as the winners of the Heisman Trophy, the Academy Award, the Olympic championship of a country that could make a defining difference at the center and in the margins of never failing to miss an opportunity, and this is the indictment on us within the region at the present time. On top of which, the malaise and the angst in response to what is perceived as American rhetoric and American pretense. Under the Bush administration, for example, his oft-stated phrase of, "I will do whatever is necessary to protect the interest of the American people and defend the United States." The italics were on the word "whatever is necessary." Whatever is necessary was not done then, and it has not been done since. Or Barack Obama's in the last 48 to 72 hours. "I will not back down from what needs to be done." Or I'd rather be a good one-term president than a mediocre two-term president. Nice words, good nouns, good verbs, nice cadence, publishable. But where's the implementation would be the question in the region there. And take health, take housing, take education, take crime. In terms of our hubris or our sermons of mass construction, as opposed to weapons of mass destruction there. In terms of housing, in all of Kuwait, and all of Bahrain, and all of Qatar, and all of Saudi Arabia, all of the United Arab Emirates, all of Oman, not one single person tonight will be homeless. In Washington, D.C., 14,600 tonight will be homeless. In New York City, 36,000 will be homeless. 18,000 of the 36,000 will be children there. In terms of education, we have between 2,800 and 3,200 universities. People differ on the numbers there. But the costs are considerable for any of you who have children, and you know that the net worth to go to Johns Hopkins or Georgetown or Stanford or Princeton or Yale or Harvard is $40,000 plus after taxes as such. No university in Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, or Oman charges a penny for its citizens. The view is that a country that has the wherewithal, can do it, is morally obligated and bound to do it, and if not, shame. With regard to health care, the number of Americans tonight, yesterday, tomorrow, for the indefinite future, who will have a pain in their chest or stomach, their first thought will be, I'll sleep well tonight, I'll have a glass of milk, I can't go to the doctor or the emergency room, I just can't afford it there. No one has that thought in the 6 countries I just mentioned, and they've made sure that no one has a reason for that thought. And on top of the education being free, the student is paid while she or he is a student, so that they won't be tempted to pump gas at night or to stay up being a hotel clerk and fall asleep in class the next day. They're there to study this, they're to learn, they're there to be a better person and to be a proactive, contributive citizen. And this is not by accident or by coincidence. One needs to structure and to decide and allocate and appropriate and authorize sources to bring about those kinds of results. And perhaps lastly, it has to do with the golden rule. Something as basic as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We have invaded and occupied 2 countries in the last half a decade plus, and we showed no signs of withdrawing or reversing those acts since. No one has invaded and occupied us, but the opposite is indeed the case. Or the 10 Commandments for those of our political and elected and appointed leaders who are pious and the like. We violate 5 of the 10 Commandments every single day in our behavior with this particular part of the world. Honor thy father and mother. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet the neighbor's assets. Thou shalt not make unto thyself a graven image. Those 5 are undeniably, unassailably violated every single day. So this aspect of hubris or ignorance or arrogance, as we're perceived to be, is not cost-free, nor is the additional indictment that, yes, America believes in justice, civil justice, other justice, but it's associated with money. If you can pay for a good lawyer, indeed, if you want justice, you are told you have to have a good lawyer, and a good lawyer commands an appropriate fee as such. I'm told that 2/3 of the people in the jails of Baltimore and Washington tonight are people who couldn't meet bail, do not have the economic wherewithal. And so the notion of justice being associated with material well-being is not exactly the best badge that we could wear. In coming to a close here with regard to our oft-stated preference to dealing with allies and friends and partners on the basis of their adherence to the rule of law. But, however, except would be the regional response. What about the United States government's own refusal and failure to adhere to its own Constitution? We have a president who is the best constitutional lawyer and teacher that we've had in living memory here. But Article 6 of the United States Constitution couldn't be clearer. It posits that all international laws, treaties, and agreements to which the United States is a signatory are superior to federally enacted legislation. And indeed, the U.S. Constitution must be the supreme law of the land. If so, Where is the adherence? Where's the administration? Where's the implementation of that element of the UN Charter that we have our fingerprints on more than any other country in terms of the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force? Where are we in terms of the Fourth Geneva Convention, in terms of the Israelis and Americans pushing harder than anybody else for that particular international law and its prohibition of an occupying power expropriating the occupied people's land, its prohibition against the occupying power of exploiting the occupied people's resources, its prohibition against the occupying power colonizing the occupied people's land, its prohibition against expelling the occupied peoples from their lands. All four of these are not so much debatable. Now, they're documented in extensive publications, government as well as others there. With regard to accountability and responsibility, these two noble, laudable concepts and principles that we would like to incorporate into our own behavior towards our fellow human beings, and certainly would not just request and ask, but demand that our elected and appointed government officials do. Consider just three. Most Americans are aware that in January 2001, there were more than 40 meetings in the office of the Vice President with America's leading oil companies. The meetings were referred to as energy and environmental meetings. Of the more than 40 meetings, only 3 dealt with the environment. All the others dealt with oil and gas, at which the maps of Iran and Iraq were brought to the meetings in terms of where the wells are, where the fields are, what are the properties of these particular energy deposits, that before the invasion of March 19, 2003, we had access to none of them. That's number one, because 2 senators, friends of mine, I spent a half a day with each one of them, both of them swore that they, being on the principal Senate committee to look into accountability and the Governmental Accounting Office, which has a primacy of task and responsibility here, that they would make sure that those who attended those meetings would be revealed to the public. When that was made clear, the then chairman of the committee, Pat Roberts of Kansas, said, if you continue to press for accountability, we will revisit the budget for the GAO. And so they backed off. And the 2 told me that they're the only 2 on the committee that showed any interest or concern in pursuing these issues. The others were into other things. Thirdly, with regard to our pressure on Kuwait's government and people to forgive Iraq's debt and Iraq's reparations to the Kuwaiti people. Now, the Kuwaiti government is empathetic and sympathetic to counseling the debt, but it is not about to touch the issue of reparations, because this has to do with the Kuwaiti people, and we're talking about tens of billions of dollars. And Americans may look at the figures and say, well, my goodness, only 750 Kuwaitis were killed and or missing in action. That's nothing compared to the missing in action and killed in Vietnam. It's nothing. That number of Kuwait citizens, 750, was 1/10%. Put in American terms, it would mean 270,000 Americans who were killed, missing. I know of no Kuwaiti who knows fewer than 5 of those who were killed and missing to this day. So again, the question of empathy and sensitivity is called into question. Or in terms of the aspect of 4 million Iraqis made refugees and domestically displaced as a direct result of what we did on March 19, 2003. 4 million Iraqi refugees and domestic displaced is 1/6 of the Iraqi population. 1/6 of the American population would be 50 million Americans who've been made refugees, internally displaced. In terms of accountability, in terms of responsibility, where is the accountability? Where is the responsibility? Coming to the end here, the conclusion by many thinkers who've been to America and know English fluently, so few of us have been to that region or know Arabic fluently or even proficiently, ask the question, how can the United States pretend to hope or expect or imagine to remain the sole indispensable paramount superpower if it continues to alienate, antagonize, insult, and humiliate 1.5 billion Muslims? Or looked at from a different way, of the 28 Middle Eastern countries, how can the United States continue to hope to be the sole superpower if it shows such unmitigated favoritism towards one of the 28, more so and other than the other 27, or arithmetically to roll the dice in favor of backing and supporting and being blindly supportive of one, which would be 4% of the 28, at the cost of alienating 96% of the 28. Or bring it down to a person, one person, one vote, one person, one right. In terms of the Israeli population of 5 million, including the 1 million Arab Christians and Muslims, equaling 1.2% of the 300 Arab Christians and Muslims, same as the American population there, which arithmetically would work out to being as supporting 1.2% against 98.8%. Now, I will close here, but not before commending this Foreign Affairs Council and the many great people from Maryland, Mac Mathias being one of them that Dr. Byrd called attention to there, but also Dwight Eisenhower. He is still the hero from one end of the region to the other for what he did in election week at that in 1956, calling off the invasion of France and Great Britain and Israel. And his brother Milton and his stewardship at Johns Hopkins University. And those at the Wilma Institute, where my wife goes and where I go, and where one of my former students is a graduate, and he heads the ophthalmology department at Georgetown now. As well as great Arab leaders who have come here. Selwa Hazar, whose mother got married when she was 13 as a Bedouin in Saudi Arabia, who has her PhD from the Wilma Institute in Johns Hopkins, and who is the leading ophthalmologist and eye doctor in all of Saudi Arabia. And the National Security Agency up the road here, on which many in the region are dependent and appreciative for its real-time intelligence to their threats to their national sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. But not least, Dr. Byrd, Kingdom Gould, the trustees and the members of this association, in terms of your extraordinary range of achievements and accomplishments there. But meritorious as these individuals are, we can close by asking ourselves the question, how would we focus on the fact that Dr. Byrd, Kingdom Gould, the trustees, the members here, have no monopoly on the method of making these kinds of results, have no patent on the process for registering these kinds of achievements, have no trademark on the technique for bringing about these positive achievements, have no copyright on the concepts. I think we can close by asking ourselves, what might we mere mortals, all of us, do to merit his mantle and that of those who have worked so closely with him? What might we, small and few in numbers, but legions nonetheless that we are, do to lengthen his legacy and the legacy of this great institution? Thank you.
Well, another experience for which we thank Dr. Anthony. We'll now have a Q&A. Dr. Anthony will call upon the questioner and repeat the question. Dr. Anthony.
Several questions were given me just while we were standing out there, and let me address them real quickly, and then we'll take those with our hands there. One was what are the motivations behind radical Islam? The core one is notions of injustice and remedying wrongs, righting grievances, and particularly those who sow chaos. In Islamic values, a person who induces chaos has directly induced the greatest sin of any leader, elected or appointed or a steward. And we are seen as associated with this, complicit with that. So there are the motivations, but none come close to that. Another one doesn't have to do with recent history and of underachievement and humiliation. This is the way that Daniel Pipes tries to put the issue here. Does it have to do with current economic conditions? The answer from my side and the other side would be no. Certainly Saudi Arabians and Egyptians are people of means, the middle class. Ayman Zawahiri comes from a distinguished upper-class medical family. Osama bin Laden is from one of the most materially successful families in all of the Arabian Peninsula, if not the Eastern Arab world. What about the extent of radical Islam? Is it growing or lessening? I believe most would say it's growing, in no small measure because of how the radicalism is being generated. The goals to expand it is being sustained and inspired, and especially the recruitment is tied to Americans' actions and non-actions, American policies and non-policies, American attitudes and non-attitudes, and American positions and non-positions there. We can discuss and debate this there. And particularly to bring it back to the U.S. Constitution, which posits four things as the reasons, the goals, the objectives for the United States of America. Namely, that its government will do its utmost to ensure domestic safety, do its utmost to ensure the country's external defense, do its utmost to address the legitimate needs of the material well-being of its citizens, do its utmost to ensure an effective civil system of justice. The indictment in the region is that we took all four of those things off the table when we invaded Iraq and smashed them to smithereens, and they have yet to return. In terms of the additional three I mentioned from the UN Charter of National Sovereignty, Political Independence, and Territorial Integrity, all seven of those resulted from the U.S. invasion and occupation of March 19th. Is it a class of civilizations? I don't think so. I think we have far more in common than we have at odds with each other. There's far more in the way of mutuality of benefit, of interdependency in the positive sense of the word, of reciprocity of reward, than the kinds of hostility, antithesis, and revenge and hatred that is also present, but not as powerful or as uplifting or as inspiring and laudable and commendable as what I just went through here. Why do moderate Muslims not express more concern? My response is they do. But like a tree that falls in the forest when no one is there, does it make a sound or does it? There's no editor of the editorial page or television or radio that's obligated by law or otherwise to mention it when moderate Arabs and Muslims do indeed take exception to this and do indeed condemn this. And the evidence is through almost all of the countries in the region that come immediately to mind. The exceptions would be just that, the exception and aberration, of the degree to which, despite the hostility that's generated in reaction to our policies and positions, actions and attitudes, the way that they are working with us in an open way, as well as a covert way, to stem the tide of the radicals, to have more actionable intelligence there, to use technology for surveillance and eavesdropping and penetration of cells. So if this is not a reaction to trying to do something about it rather than passive and acquiescent, I don't know what is there.